Good morning and welcome to another daily word from the Lord. And we have been reflecting on the eighth beatitude that Jesus lifted up in the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs shall be the kingdom of heaven. And yesterday we looked at the history of the words, "What would Jesus do?" that was popularized in bracelets and t-shirts and merchandise, WWJD. And we discovered that it wasn't original with the movement that became popular in the 1990s, but it actually was more than a century before, when a gentleman by the name of Sheldon wrote a book called "What Would Jesus Do?" And I want to share with you a hymn that was written by a gentleman by the name of Daniel Otis Teasley, who was a Church of God minister who lived from 1876 and who died in 1942. And somewhere in the early 1900s, he wrote a hymn called "What Would Jesus Do?" And I share with you the words of it. If the sinful ways of life you are tempted to pursue, just stop and think before you yield. What would Jesus do? What would Jesus do? What would Jesus do? When you're tempted, always stop and think. What would Jesus do? Let your heart from sin be clean, and your strength in him renew. Let meekness in your works be seen. Thus would Jesus do. If your brother is in need, and to him you would be true, then show your love by word and deed. Thus would Jesus do. Let your light forever shine. Keep the will of God in view. To sinners prove his love divine. Thus would Jesus do. When you're to the judgment brought, will you always have been true? Then don't forget the solemn thought. What would Jesus do? What would Jesus do? What would Jesus do? When you're tempted, always stop and think. What would Jesus do? The hymn and the phrase, WWJD, what would Jesus do, is very powerful. But its popularity and its having become so well known can hide and cover a very somber and sober truth. And that is, sometimes, in fact, many times, or maybe even all the time, JWD can get us into some mighty big trouble. You may ask, what is DWJWD? That is, doing what Jesus would do. Sometimes, maybe all the time, doing what Jesus would do gets us into some mighty big trouble. You say, how can I say that? Well, remember, don't forget, Jesus was crucified on the cross of Calvary. Why? For causing trouble and getting on the wrong side of the religious Jewish leaders and the Roman and Jewish political leaders. We tend to forget that. Why was Jesus killed? For getting in trouble with the powers that be and the powers that existed. And he got in trouble because he insisted on doing the right thing. And they didn't like it. And so they began to pressure him. They began to oppose him. They began to resist him. And they began to persecute him, even to the point of death. And so while it sounds good, what would Jesus do? And while it sounds great, oh, I'm going to do what Jesus would do in every situation, yeah, well, good. But then anticipate and expect to get in trouble for doing what Jesus would do, just like Jesus did. Because doing what Jesus would do still gets the followers of Jesus in trouble today, and will bring persecution to those who dare to call for righteousness, and who dare to live for righteousness, and who dare to work for righteousness. But we cannot hold back from getting in good trouble. And John Lewis, there's a movie that was made about his life. And you know what it's called? Getting in Good Trouble. John Lewis said, we can't be afraid and we can't withdraw from getting in good trouble. And by good trouble, he meant doing the right thing, even if it gets you in trouble. And John Lewis continued to stand for righteousness and to do the right thing and to get in good trouble. As I said in another devotion, he was imprisoned over 40 times in the 1960s. He was beaten and battered. His skull was crushed. But it didn't stop him from doing the right thing and getting in what he called good trouble. He said when he left home, his mother and father sat him down and he said, "Now son, don't you go and get yourself in no trouble." He said, but as soon as I got out and I saw the world and I saw the injustice and I saw the inequality that existed, and I heard the sermons of Martin Luther King Jr., I knew that I had to throw in my hand and stand up for what was right and do the right thing. And I hope that my parents understood that, yeah, I was getting in trouble, but this was good trouble. We cannot be afraid, brothers and sisters, to get in good trouble. Because if we follow Jesus, we will find ourselves getting into some good trouble, just like John Lewis did and just like Jesus did. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. Theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Lord, help me and give me the courage and the fortitude to stand and to do the right thing, even if it gets me into some trouble. Help me to take courage and find strength in knowing that it's good trouble, and that you will always reward those who stand with you for righteousness.